Here's a question that sounds almost like a trick question, but isn't. What did humans actually eat before they had fire? The honest answer involves a surprising amount of raw meat, a genuinely impressive variety of insects, several categories of food that would horrify a modern health inspector, and a digestive system that was by necessity considerably more robust and considerably less picky than the one you are currently using to process your lunch. Before fire, eating was not the controlled, predictable, relatively safe activity it is today. It was a constant negotiation with raw biology, bacterial risk, mechanical difficulty, and the simple problem of extracting enough calories from foods that had not yet been chemically transformed by heat into something easier to digest. So let us actually walk through what was on the ancient pre-fire menu, why it looked the way it did, and what this reveals about a period of human evolutionary history that gets dramatically less attention than it deserves, mostly because it happened before the invention of the one technology, cooking, that makes for such a satisfying before and after story. Before we get into the food itself, one number is worth sitting with. Our broader genus Homo stretches back close to 3 million years, but the controlled, deliberate use of fire as a routine technology appears to have become widespread somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million years ago, which means that for an enormous stretch of hominin history, our ancestors were eating an entirely raw diet, not as some kind of survivalist novelty, as the only available option, generation after generation after generation. That is the scale of what we are talking about. Let us begin with meat, because meat is where the story gets most interesting most quickly. The archaeological evidence for meat consumption among early hominins predates controlled fire use by an enormous margin. Cut marks on animal bones produced by stone tools used to butcher carcasses appear in the record at sites dating back at least 2.5 million years. Hominins were eating raw meat, raw by definition, for well over 1 million years before they had any way to cook it. What did that actually involve? The honest answer is considerably more chewing than modern humans are accustomed to, and a genuine and persistent risk of bacterial and parasitic infection. Raw meat is mechanically tough. Muscle fibers and connective tissue require significantly more chewing force and time to break down than cooked meat, where heat has already begun softening the fiber structure. This is part of why early hominin skulls show such robust jaw musculature relative to modern humans. The mechanical demands of a raw diet literally shaped the bones of their faces in ways that cooking eventually undid. The bacterial and parasitic risk was genuinely significant. Modern food safety guidelines exist precisely because raw meat carries meaningful risk from pathogens that cooking substantially eliminates. Early hominins were exposed to all of these risks without any modern interventions. This raises an obvious and genuinely interesting question. How did they survive this for millions of years? Two answers. First, hominin gut physiology was probably somewhat more aggressive in its pathogen killing capacity than strictly necessary for a cooked food diet. Second, and this deserves real emphasis, they almost certainly suffered genuinely significant rates of illness and death directly attributable to raw food consumption, and simply survive this burden as one of many mortality risks in an environment already characterized by extraordinarily high background mortality from numerous other sources. They were not thriving on raw meat. They were tolerating it because the alternative was starvation. Beyond muscle tissue, early hominins almost certainly consumed organ meats with particular enthusiasm. Liver, kidney, brain, and especially bone marrow are considerably softer than muscle, requiring far less chewing effort to consume raw, while simultaneously offering extremely high concentrations of specific nutrients. Bone marrow deserves particular attention. The archaeological evidence for deliberate marrow extraction is genuinely extensive. Many cut marks and percussion marks found on ancient animal bones are specifically consistent with intentional bone breaking to access the marrow cavity. Marrow is essentially pure fat, calorically dense, easily consumed, requiring no fire. For a species working with an entirely raw food supply, it represented an extremely efficient source of concentrated calories. There is also the question of where the meat came from. The honest answer, based on the evidence, is both hunting and scavenging, with the specific balance shifting across different species and time periods. A substantial body of evidence suggests early hominins may have relied significantly on accessing carcasses already killed by other predators. Scavenged carcasses range from relatively fresh to genuinely well into the process of decomposition. The practical reality of a scavenging-dependent diet almost certainly meant that at least some portion of what was being consumed was considerably less fresh than what any modern person would willingly eat. Now let us turn to the plant side of the diet, because plant foods almost certainly represented the bulk of caloric intake for most hominin populations across most of this period. The central challenge with raw plant consumption is starch. Many of the most calorically dense plant foods available, tubers, roots, underground storage organs, contain starch in a form that the human digestive system has considerable difficulty breaking down when raw. Raw starch exists in a crystalline structure that resists digestive enzymes. Cooking disrupts this through gelatinization. Heat and moisture cause the starch granules to swell and rupture, exposing dramatically more surface area to digestion. Studies comparing the caloric yield of raw versus cooked starchy foods have found substantial differences, with a meaningful percentage of raw starch passing through the human digestive system essentially undigested. So how did early hominins extract sufficient calories from plant sources? Mechanical processing helped. Pounding and thorough chewing increased surface area exposed to enzymes. But perhaps most importantly, early hominins almost certainly relied more heavily on plant foods that did not present the starch problem in the first place. Ripe fruits contain sugars in forms directly absorbable without enzymatic breakdown. Nuts and seeds contain fats and proteins that do not face the same digestibility gap. The pre-fire hominin diet almost certainly emphasized fruits, nuts, seeds, and leafy material more heavily than starchy roots, with tubers becoming dramatically more nutritionally valuable specifically after cooking became routine. Insects also deserve more attention in this discussion than they typically receive. Termites, ants, grubs, and beetle larvae represented a reliable, year-round, easily accessible source of fat and protein that required absolutely no cooking to be both palatable and nutritionally valuable. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, engage in extensive and sophisticated insect foraging, including the use of tools to extract termites from their nests. If chimpanzees are doing this with sticks and stones, early hominins almost certainly were too, and probably more systematically. Honey also deserves mention as one of the most calorically dense and immediately accessible foods available. Requiring no processing whatsoever to be digested with full efficiency, the challenge was never digesting honey, the challenge was getting past the bees. Here is the part of the story that most people miss, and it is the part that connects everything else together. The human gastrointestinal tract is, relative to body size, notably smaller than that of our closest living primate relatives, particularly when comparing the size of the colon. This reduction is widely interpreted as a direct consequence of cooking. A smaller gut became metabolically viable once cooking began pre-processing food in ways that reduced the digestive workload previously handled by gut tissue itself. This connects directly to one of the more compelling arguments in the scientific literature about human brain evolution, sometimes called the expensive tissue hypothesis, developed by researchers including Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler. The core argument holds that the human brain's unusually large size was made metabolically possible specifically because the human gut shrank in compensation, freeing up the substantial metabolic budget that a larger, more ape-like gut would otherwise have consumed. Think about what that means. A hominin population still eating an entirely raw diet, still relying on a larger gut to extract sufficient energy from uncooked food, would have been operating under genuinely tighter metabolic constraints on brain size than hominins who had access to cooking. Fire did not just change dinner. Fire may have changed the ceiling on what our brains were allowed to become. The pre-fire diet in this light was not simply a difficult chapter that hominins endured before the real story began. It was itself an essential part of that story, a multi-million-year proving ground during which the behavioral flexibility, strategic thinking, and accumulated practical knowledge that would eventually define our entire species were being tested and selected for. One raw meal, one foraged tuber, one scavenged carcass, and one handful of insects at a time. They did not thrive on that diet, they survived it, and surviving it is what made us capable of everything that came after. So the next time you sit down to a cooked meal, it's worth remembering what that meal actually replaced. Millions of years of raw meat, foraged roots, insects, and scavenged carcasses, eaten not because it was ideal, but because it was what was available. Fire didn't just make food taste better, it rewired what our bodies could afford to build. It's easy to take a cooked meal for granted, but every bite is standing on top of millions of years of trial, error, and sheer stubborn survival. And that's a story worth sticking around for.